I'm now joined by the organizing legend who helped turn Georgia blue after nearly 2 decades of Republican wins. In her spare time, she's written her ninth novel, the #1 New York Times bestseller, While Justice Sleeps. Stacey Abrams, welcome back to the pod.
Thank you for having me.
So we were just talking about the coordinated Republican attack on voting rights. I'll be honest, I'm sort of at a loss right now about what to do. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema have ruled out getting rid of the filibuster. Manchin has said no on a filibuster carve-out for voting rights, which is what you've suggested. And even if there were no filibuster, he said he doesn't actually support the For the People Act as written, which we can't pass without him. So how do we protect the right to vote?
I begin with the posture that people take positions based on the current environment, and that the more we see evidence of perfidy and malfeasance, the more likely we are to see change. I believe that as a former Secretary of State, that Joe Manchin understands how fragile our democracy actually is without the rule of law to protect the most vulnerable voters. And his ethos, which is to say that he wants to protect the voice of minorities in the Senate, should extend to protecting the voice of minorities as American citizens. Part of what we are seeing play out here is shifting the narrative from one of this is Democrats versus Republicans to one of this being Republicans versus Americans. This is not partisanship. This is about citizenship. And the more we can amplify and populate with evidence the proof of their intention, I think the more likely we are to actually see a shift in behavior. I can't say that's for certain, but I know that given my time in the state legislature, there were moments where I was absolutely certain, or at least certainly I should have been convinced that no movement was possible, but I saw it happen. Now, that notwithstanding, we still have to fight. We need to get to the place where we can get people on board. And that means really articulating the critical provisions of the For the People Act, which are essential. That may mean that we can't have everything we want in the For the People Act, but we must have enough to preserve access to the ballot. And I think what we saw happen in Texas, what happens in Georgia, what happened in Florida, what happened in Arizona, what's about to happen in Ohio, what happened in Oklahoma and in Kansas and in Iowa signal that this is not a limited issue. This is not a Southern issue. This is not a Black issue. This is a citizenship democracy issue, and it is a continuation of the insurrection. And I know that Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema have both signaled that they believe that the insurrection was wrong, and thus we should be holding them accountable and providing the evidence necessary to demonstrate that if you disagreed with the attempt to dismantle our democracy on January 6th, you should disagree with this coordinated attack on our democracy at the state level.
Have you had any conversations with Manchin or Sinema about this topic?
I have not.
Do you think you might?
I would hope so, but part of my responsibility is to make certain that we as a nation are speaking with one voice about this issue, that we move this beyond a conversation of what happened in November of 2020 to a conversation of what is going to happen to us in 2030 or 2022 or 2024 if we do not address this triple assault on our democracy.
You mentioned making sure that a final bill had the most critical provisions of H.R. 1 of the For the People Act. What do you think are like the we can't live without provisions in that bill?
So I would start with what's happening at the state level to signal. So there are three pieces. One is the anti-voter provisions that are sweeping our country. And that means that we have to protect voters in their right to access, the right to register, the right to stay on the rolls, their right to cast a ballot, and their right to have those ballots counted. So can you register and stay? Can you cast? Can you count? That means we have to have automatic voter registration, same-day registration. We have to have in-person early voting no matter where you live, because we no longer live in an agrarian economy where everyone can take off Tuesday in November to go and vote. And we have to have no excuses absentee balloting, because the Republican intent is to limit voting to a single day unless you are infirm, disabled, elderly, or in the military. Those should not be the only exceptions we make to a system that was put in place long before our economy evolved, before our nation evolved. So we have to push back against the anti-voter provisions. The second wave of attack is against election workers themselves. And we are seeing this play out in response to the horrific lies told about election workers in Michigan and in Georgia and in Arizona. And a number of these laws are weakening their protections, increasing their liability, and putting them in harm's way by allowing more poll watchers, meaning poll intimidators, to come in and question their work without evidence or without knowledge. And then the third attack that's happening is that we are watching a subversion of American democracy by allowing legislators, people in power to overturn the outcome of elections. I mean, in Texas, the bill that was stopped briefly, unfortunately, it will come back in special session, said that you could try to overturn an election without proof of fraud, which means that you just don't have, if you just don't like the outcome. And there are going to be those who push back and say, that's not what it says exactly, but I'm a good enough lawyer. And it's similar to what they've done in Georgia. When laws are this porous and when they're this poorly written and this hidden from investigation, you know that the intention is to allow the unspoken to become the rule. And when we can have our elections overturned by the bad actions of others, that is deeply problematic. Right now, the For the People Act addresses the anti-voting provisions. There are conversations about adding more protections in for election workers and the subversion of democracy. But those are the three pieces that we're going to absolutely have to move if we want to see sound elections heading forward.
I'm really interested in that last part because I know a lot of people have pointed out that the current version of the For the People Act doesn't include enough protections around election subversion. Have you heard of legislative proposals anywhere that would address that, whether it's a state legislature overturning the election, whether it's the House of Representatives, whether it's a county board, a Secretary of State's office? Obviously, Republicans are trying to plant Trumpy people in all of these offices, but how do we prevent against that? What can we do to prevent election subversion?
So they're not only trying to plant people in, they're actually trying to strip people of power, what they did to Secretary of State Katie Hobbs. And we've seen vestiges of this when Republicans won recent elections. They go in and strip the constitutional officers of power that have, people have enjoyed or that these offices have held for decades, if not centuries. So what we know is that this is a new phenomenon. And so I don't think legislation has been introduced, but I have great faith that legislation will soon follow because we're just now seeing this play out. Now, we've been warning about it for a while, but now that we actually see it happening, when when the Heritage Action Fund for America acknowledges their intention, I think that finally signals that we need legislative action. So my hope is that as this bill moves forward, if amendments are allowed, that we will see the kind of amendments necessary to protect against what is happening at the state level.
You and I have talked before about how one of the more pernicious aspects of voter suppression is that it makes people think this just isn't worth it. I might as well stay home. If this round of voter restrictions becomes law, or at least if some of them become law, how do we get people to believe that their vote in 2022 matters and will be counted?
By talking about what's happening now. As long as this is framed as Democrats versus Republicans, as progressives versus conservatives, it's a pox on all your houses. But when we frame this for voters as a conversation about your right to be heard in the future, if you were unhappy with the response in your community to COVID-19 and you want to have a say the next election, this is going to be a problem. If your children didn't have access to the technology they needed to participate in remote learning, the school board elections matter. And these laws are not just about the presidential election. These laws, once they become inculcated into our fabric, they affect every election and every facet of life. And so we've got to talk about this as one, an attack on democracy, and two, an attack on community. When you are being told as a community that you will not have the right to make decisions without someone coming in and possibly overturning your choice, regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, as a citizen, that is a subversion of democracy. And so I think the way we get people on board is that we do what we're trying to do through stopjimcrow2.com, which is that we're talking about voter suppression every day. The more we talk about it, the more people realize this is a systematic attack on their right to vote. And for communities of color in particular, it's been a systemic issue. But that we have to frame this as a systematic attack that can only be thwarted the same way we took action in 2020 and 2021, and that's by showing up and declaring what we want.
Speaking of 2022, what, if anything, would prevent you from being a candidate for governor of Georgia? I figured I'd try it that way.
And that's a novel approach. Nicely done. My focus right now is on making sure we have elections, but I'm also really focused on making sure that the work that I need to do doesn't get clouded by conversations about what I may want personally. This is an all call. And my responsibility as someone who is speaking about this issue is to be solely and singularly focused on how we make our democracy stronger. And so I'm not making any decisions about my personal, investment anytime soon.
Do you have a timeline in mind? Because I know that for the 18 race, it was June of this year, the year before the race, that you made the formal announcement that you were running.
I don't have a timeline. I will say this. It's very different. Where I was in 17 versus where I am now.
That is true.
Is different. And part of what I hope for is that we are building an infrastructure for Georgia and for the country that doesn't require that kind of advanced, behavior. Mm-hmm. Luckily, the infrastructure we built in 2017 morphed into the infrastructure that became Fair Fight. I do not intend to leverage it for any other purpose than to fight for democracy. But what I mean is that infrastructure that made it possible for more voters to be heard, which is what my campaign was grounded in. It was grounded in turning out voters who had not been heard before. As long as that work continues, as long as we continue to amplify the voices of citizens, lift up the needs of residents and community members, then that work is good and that work is being done. And I've got some time to think about the rest.
Can we nerd out about writing for a few
Absolutely.
questions? Okay. So I got into bed the other night, and my wife, Emily, was reading your latest novel, While Justice Sleeps. And she had this pained expression on her face. And I was like, do you not like it? And she said, no, I love it, but I can barely respond to emails. Like, how on earth does Stacey Abrams find time to write a novel while she's flipping Georgia? Which I thought would be a good question to ask you. Like, what made you want to write this in the middle of everything else you're doing? And how do you find the time? When do you write?
Okay, so in defense of everyone, I wrote this book actually a decade ago and could not get anyone to buy it because they thought that it was absurd that there would be a corrupt president involved in international intrigue or that the Supreme Court would matter. So,
well, that's fun.
Yeah. So once those became prescient, I went from being absurd to being prescient, then people were willing to buy the book. And I did spend a lot of 2019 and early 2020 tweaking it and bringing it up to speed. There were a few anachronistic moments in the book, like Avery Keene had a flip phone when I wrote it. There were no smartphones to be heard of, so I had to fix some of those pieces. There were some DC folks who pointed out that when I lived in DC and what Adams Morgan was like before gentrification is not where it is today.
That is true.
In the last 10 years, but I write because I love telling stories, and I try to make sure I carve out time for myself when I've got a story to tell or when I have a book contract to get the book done. And as you know, John, the impetus of a contract to either want the book or their money back gets you to write really fast.
Yeah, that is true. Do you find it easier to write your novels or your political speeches? And which do you enjoy more?
So I actually don't write most of my speeches down. I tend to speak extemporaneously. So I usually have you sort of figure out your general themes, and I react to the crowd when I do speeches. My nonfiction writing is just a different type of writing. But for me, I've always written fiction and nonfiction at the same time. I wrote my romance novels when I was writing, my treatises on tax exemptions and the unrelated business income tax policies. So for me, it's just two different sides of my brain, but it's the same responsibility.
I'd say that's some real compartmentalization right there, writing a treatise on tax laws while you're writing romance novels. Not too many people do that, I imagine.
I'm in the small club, yes.
How has being a novelist affected how you think about political communication? Because, I had the experience of writing with Barack Obama, and he wasn't a novelist, but he was a writer, and watching his transition from being a writer into being sort of a political speaker was interesting to watch. But someone who's written fiction, I'd be even more interested to know how you see that.
Whether it's politics or advocacy or business or writing, it's all about telling a good story. And when I say a good story, it's about, one, making sure your audience can situate themselves in your narrative. Two, that they share your vision for what is to be. and three, that you are so compelling in your imaginings that it feels possible and real. Those are things that you have to do no matter where you are in the universe of behaviors. And for me, it's self-reinforcing. If I'm a good fiction writer, it's because I have to bring enough pathos and humanity to what I say. If I'm writing well in nonfiction, it's because I can take what seems like a stultifying, if not absolutely, just paralyzingly boring topic and make you care about it for a while. And when I'm talking, when I'm giving political speeches, whether I'm talking about, Freeport exemptions or, criminal justice reform, you've got to believe not only that it's possible, but that you have a role to play in making it so. And so I see it all as a through line.
So you talked about story. When it comes to the broader story that Democrats tell about what we're for and who we're fighting for, there's been this long-running debate, I know you're very familiar with it, over how much the party should emphasize issues of class and economics versus issues of race and identity. I don't know if you saw this study that came out of Yale last month, but these two political scientists, Micah English and Joshua Kalla, asked 5,000 people about 6 policies using different messaging frames. Central finding of their study was that linking public policies to race is detrimental for support of those policies. Now, you've weighed in on this larger debate before in a brilliant foreign affairs essay about identity politics, which everyone should go read if you haven't. But what do you think about those findings and what they say about how Democrats should frame messages and support for policies?
I begin by critiquing the comparison to Republicans. Republicans are largely a very homogenous party with a fairly unitary notion of what their mission is. Mm-hmm. Democrats are everyone else. And so even with a study with 5,000 people, 5,000 people are not going to vote the same way. And you've got to piece together a coalition that of that 5,000 will include the 300, and I'm making that number up because I didn't read the study, the 300 people for whom race was resonant, in fact, was the most important part of it. If you leave them out, that is the margin by which you lose an election because they don't show up. And this notion that we can be so reductive in our politics on the Democratic side, as we have seen be so successful for Republicans, ignores the complexity of our party and the range of needs of our constituents. My point is not that we have to have this overly simplistic messaging, but we've got to be clear about why we're talking about what we're talking about and who we're talking to. I mean, just going to your earlier question about the timing when I started running in 2017, I had to talk to people who had never heard from a politician. And that took a lot of time. And I had to be very specific in my conversations. I told the same story everywhere, but I made certain that I made the story relevant to each person. And so sometimes the relevance of a policy is about the race experience. Some it's about the class experience. For others, it's a geography issue. For some, it's tangential to their identity, but central to their future. And the role of a good politician and the effectiveness of a party is the ability to walk, chew gum at the same time and to understand that there are going to be those who join us part of the way and who peel off. And our mission is to make sure they're not peeling off to go to the other side. They're just peeling off because they got distracted and we got to go and get them again. That's the most effective way for us to message. But this notion that we have to ignore factions of our community in order to satisfy and mollify those for whom this is discomforting is exactly how we lose elections. And I'm hopeful that because of the proof points of so many communities of color showing up in 2020 and 2021 in Georgia, that we have seen that it is worthwhile to have multiple conversations as long as we have the same core message, which is that we are here with you, for you, and we are about you.
So one more language question for you about sort of the most effective way for Democrats to talk about particularly issues of race and identity. Longtime Democratic strategist James Carville stirred up a debate last month. He gave this interview to Vox where he said, wokeness is a problem and everyone knows it. We have to talk about race. We should talk about racial injustice. What I'm saying is we need to do it without using jargony language that's unrecognizable to most people, including most black people, because it signals that you're trying to talk around them. The example he uses are words like Latinx and phrases like communities of color, which he calls faculty lounge language that most people don't use. Now, since you just helped flip a red Southern state for the first time since James won his last election in 1992, I figured I would ask you for your reaction to that as someone who thinks a lot about language and communication, and like you just said, has gone to communities where people have never heard from a politician, let alone have heard progressive language.
Again, it depends on who you're talking to. The language that's sometimes dismissed as jargony sounds jargony to older people. But if you're in a room with 18 to 22-year-olds having a conversation about race and you don't understand their lexicon, you are going to lose them. So we have to be fluent in multiple languages, including what can be termed derogatively as wokeness. It's not that. It's about being able to meet people where they are. And that language is very pervasive for a segment of the population that we need to have turn out to vote. There are other communities where I would never use language like that, but I need to have every set of conversations in my back pocket so that when I'm talking to a community, they believe that I understand them, or at least that we are starting with the same baseline. And so I don't think he's wrong, but I do think there's something that is slightly off key when you presume that your experience is normative for everyone. There are communities for whom they need to hear you use their language in reflection of their experiences because that's how they describe it to themselves. And we've got a lot of communities for whom what's dismissed as wokeness is more, this is the first time we've had language to describe our experiences of these issues in our moment in this political space. And it's an important thing for us to be able to differentiate. Yes, use the language that makes the most sense where you are, but don't ignore or dismiss the language that works in other places.
Last question, because we always like to give our listeners something to do, and you do great calls to action. If people are worried about voting rights right now and the attack on voting rights, and they are calling their representatives and they're talking to a Joe Manchin or a Kyrsten Sinema, what should their message be? What would your message be?
One, that our democracy is in peril, and that January 6th wasn't an anomaly. It was a call to action for so many. And our response has to be defending our democracy by leveraging it as best we can. That means, one, we've got to talk about voter suppression, and we've got to use real stories and real examples. And we've got to talk about it everywhere. This isn't a Southern problem. This isn't a Republican problem. This is an American problem. And we've got to keep talking about it, especially on social media, particularly outside of Twitter, because the disinformation campaign that is happening is so aggressive that we've got to be everywhere telling the counter narrative, talking up the For the People Act, talking up the Jon Lovett Voting Rights Advancement Act, and talking about the fact that voter suppression is real. Number two, support all of the voting rights organizations where you live, because even if it's not happening to your community on the macro level, strengthening voting rights everywhere strengthens it for everyone. And then number three, call your congressmen, congresswomen, call your senators, and demand that they pass the For the People Act and the Jon Lovett Voting Rights Advancement Act. And to get all this in a much more succinct form, go to stopjimcrow2.com.
Outstanding. Stacey Abrams, thank you so much for joining us as always. Come back anytime. We really appreciate the time.
Thank you, John. And please tell Emily thank you for reading my book.
I will, for sure.
Take care.